Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 297th episode of Primo Radical. Once again today, folks, I'll just be providing you with a monologue episode. There's no guest today. And I have to say, I'm pretty appreciative and surprised by the fact that I've been getting, a decent listenership for the last few episodes, just given the fact that it's just me talking and no visuals at all. My last episode, earlier this week, it actually outperformed everything else that I've done since December, including having a couple guests on earlier this year. So kind of surprised by that, but again, appreciative of all of you listening as always. And as I've been mentioning lately, we are rapidly approaching the 300th episode. That will also be a celebration of 10 years of doing this show. And looking back at the past 10 years, it's really surprising to me how I've been able to have so many big guests on. When I first started out doing this, it was really just hanging out with some friends, and then kind of on a lark, I had started reaching out to some bigger name people to be on. Bob Backlund, the former WWF champion, he was on episode number 5, so the first celebrity who was on the show. And then Noam Chomsky was on for the first time on episode number 24. And from there, it just it started rolling with more and more big name guests. I've been lucky to have lots of people on over the years, too many to name right now, but all kinds of different celebrities, presidential candidates, congressmen, former governor Jesse Ventura, former Senator Mike Gravel, the late Mike Gravel, who was on several times. So it's just kind of amazing the fact that I started out doing this podcast with my friends, just kind of hanging out and talking about anything and everything. The fact that it actually grew into a real interview show over the years. But again, folks, today I do not have any interview. I just wanted to touch base again on some global events. The real distressing one at the moment is the fact that it looks as though Israel is going to be conducting a full-scale invasion of Gaza. They are calling up 50,000 reservists and have been pretty much warning for the last month or so, last several weeks, that they are going to be conducting a true full invasion of Gaza. And with all of the rhetoric that we've heard from Netanyahu and Trump about potentially just taking Gaza and annexing it and making it part of Israel, this is really distressing. We've been living through a genocide for the last couple of years here in Gaza, really, throughout Palestine for a lot longer than that. But the indiscriminate killing of civilians in Gaza over the last couple of years has just been off the charts. And, at what point does it go from folks who are critical of Israel calling it a genocide to it actually substantially being, to the world having to define it as a real genocide? What percentage of Gazans need to die before that's recognized? And we've had this mass starvation that's been happening more recently. So you're talking essentially about a full-scale invasion of a population who's been relentlessly bombed and who's been starving for quite some time now. So it's a really distressing situation, and it doesn't look as though there's any real off-ramp to prevent that. As we all know, Donald Trump and pretty much all of the Republican Party is very in favor and supportive of what Israel is doing. They are just sycophants of Benjamin Netanyahu, and there is no questioning of what he's doing and full-throated support of him carrying out this assault on Gaza, and not to mention all of Israel's neighbors. The attacks that have taken place in Lebanon and in Syria and in Iran and the whole region, it just seems as though the Republican Party especially is very supportive of that. Not to mention the censorship that's taken place domestically, the criminalization of BDS over recent years and how Republicans have embraced that. It's just, it's really insane, and it's unfortunate. Now, of course, the Democratic Party is not at all really opposing what Israel's doing either. We saw that with President Biden and him facilitating this genocide. But, there is some minor criticism within the Democratic Party of Israel, at least in terms of rhetoric. Now turn that around and look at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. We do have some positive movements there, but we're also still in a very dangerous position. We just had a drone crash in Poland, and this is allegedly a Russian drone that crashed in Poland, in a NATO country, which, in theory could trigger Article 5, which would mean World War III between NATO and Russia. It kind of is reminiscent of a couple of years ago when a Ukrainian missile landed in Poland and killed a couple people, and Ukraine claimed that this was a Russian missile. So there was sort of a red alert for a few hours at least, where people thought this may be the start of World War III. But it turned out that it was acknowledged that this was actually a Ukrainian missile. Ukraine was lying. It was not a Russian missile. But if this is a Russian drone that crashed in Poland, that just goes to show you how we remain on the precipice of World War III. Any missile that falls outside of where it's supposed to land, anything that kind of goes over the line, that could trigger retaliation from NATO against Russia. We also saw this with some German jets being scrambled around Romania as well the past few days. So again, even though there is some negotiation going on, even though Trump is meeting with Putin and Zelensky and trying to arrange some kind of deal, Trump has also remained somewhat critical and unpredictable in terms of his relationship with Russia. Despite what Democrats claim about Trump being a Putin puppet, Trump really is part of the deep state, part of the military-industrial complex, so he could overreact, or things could just get out of hand very quickly. And that's been the case over the last 3 years of this war going on, 3.5 years. So we remain in a very dangerous geopolitical climate between Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine. And again, although Trump is at least trying to have some negotiations, a lot of Republicans are not supportive of that. And the Democratic Party, as we know, is completely anti-Russia, is completely in favor of effectively war with Russia, supporting this military intervention in Ukraine and backing Ukraine against Russia. There is literally no dissenting voice within the Democratic Party. Not one person, not Bernie Sanders, not the fraud squad, nobody who has objected to this war in Ukraine. And I think that dichotomy really speaks to, again, what kind of farce we have when it comes to the geopolitics, domestic politics, and the U.S. foreign policy overall, because there's these two different wars going on, and you have one party where there's some criticism of one war and the other party where there's some criticism of that war, but you don't see any real voices out there who are critical of both wars. If you do, it's a couple of Republicans, maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene, maybe Thomas Massie, but again, there's no Democrat who's criticizing the war in Ukraine, and it's much more common to find Republicans and Democrats who are vocally supportive of both wars, who want to help Israel keep engaging in this genocide, and who want to keep us on the precipice of World War III with the country that has more nuclear weapons than any country on earth. So it just begs the question, where are the peace voices out there? Where are the modern Ron Pauls and Mike Gravells and Dennis Kuciniches? Where are the folks who are against both wars? Even Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy, they support this genocide that's taking place in Gaza effectively. And it's really curious looking back at how 20 years ago there was a real anti-war movement in the U.S. against what the Bush administration was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and this war on terror. Although the mainstream politicians were supportive of the war, even the Democrats like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, it was recognized that there was an anti-war movement on the left and among libertarians and some paleo conservatives. And eventually things started moving more and more against the Bush administration, and you started seeing Democratic politicians showing up at these anti-war rallies. And then that turned into Democrats really running against the war in 2006. That led to the blue wave, the massive defeat for Republicans in 2006, where they lost the House and lost the Senate. And then in 2008, obviously there was a bit of a civil war within the Democratic Party in the primaries between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. But Barack Obama, as we all know, defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2008 Democratic primaries. And again, that largely really was the result of that foreign policy perspective, that foreign policy dynamic of Hillary Clinton supporting the war in Iraq, and people being sick of not just the Iraq war, but the war on terror and everything that was happening, with the Bush administration overall, the corruption and everything. And you can kind of see this in the media if you go back to that time period. If you look at things like Team America World Police or the Harold and Kumar movies, if you look at, there was a real concern about what the Bush administration was doing, where it was going. I mean, even, look at The Daily Show, look at Fahrenheit 9/11. There was a real concern about this pro-war neoconservatism and, the threat that it had on civil liberties. It's interesting that we don't really have that much anymore. We have these criticisms of Trump where, again, he's a Putin puppet, or, he lies, he's whatever, unhinged. But we don't really see that overall concern about what Palantir is doing. We don't see that overall concern about the fact that both parties are supportive of at least one war, if not both. And that, again, just goes back to what I talked about in the last episode of this real BS pro wrestling political climate that we're in, where we're sort of shoehorned into supporting one side or the other, and both sides are really the same team. So no matter whether you vote blue, no matter whether you vote red, you're effectively supporting war. And again, the majority of Republicans and majority of Democrats really support both wars, so there's really not any dissent anywhere to be found. So it seems as though culturally there has to be a shift. There has to be people who are willing to break free from that dynamic, to break free from all of the political parties, to come together and just say, we're fed up with the system overall. We're fed up with war. We're fed up with these restrictions on our civil liberties. We're fed up with the economy. We're fed up with everything. And just, we have to, I think, get rid of all these labels, right? Because that's really what's dividing us at this point. Oh, you're woke, you're a right-winger, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a conservative, you're a liberal, you're a capitalist, you're a socialist. These terms really are just serving to divide us and not providing any avenue for changing the system in any meaningful way. Because the logically consistent stance is to be against war across the board, to be against supporting Israel as it carries out a genocide, to be against supporting Ukraine as it is putting us on the precipice of World War III, by extension not support NATO, this military alliance of all of these different colonizer countries who have at one time or the other attempted to colonize much of the world. And, not to mention all of the recent crimes in Serbia, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Those were NATO countries carrying out those operations. So, again, I think what we need to do is somehow find a way to get together. And I think on an individual basis, really move past these political alliances and political labels, and just understand that we're all just normal working class people. We're not members of these political parties. We're not beholden to these labels and these ideologies, and just have to break free and say, okay, how can I work with my neighbors to, again, do things like start a soup kitchen, start these mechanisms of mutual aid to support each other and oppose the system? How can we unionize our workplaces? How can we engage in things like BDS? Or how can we oppose the war. We need to go back out in the streets and be marching against wars again, to be marching against both what Israel's doing and the war in Ukraine. Like, that's what needs to happen. Where is that movement? Where is the consistently anti-war rally out there today? Like, what would happen if you went to one of these protests against the genocide in Gaza and said, yes, I'm against the war in Gaza, and I also want to end the war in Ukraine? I don't know how that would go over. I don't know if you'd be assaulted by that anti-war crowd. And, obviously there's no real protests at all to end the war in Ukraine. It's just sort of, this thing that's floating around in mostly conservative politics. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, think about this, look at ourselves, look at the labels that we associate ourselves with, look at these ideologies. And I think that's going to be hard in lots of ways, right? Because maybe we have to recognize that these terms and these labels are outdated. Do capitalism and socialism really apply to the global financial system that we have now? This union between big government and big business, like, is that capitalism or is it socialism? Is it corporate socialism? Is it crony capitalism? Like, what do you call that? State capitalism? Like, what is the term that you would use to apply to, again, the military industrial complex, these huge corporations working together with a tyrannical government? I don't know what you could call that. I don't think that really, in a strict sense, those 19th century terms, capitalism and socialism, apply to that. So, again, I think we have to stop thinking in terms of who's on the left, who's on the right, who's Republican, who's a Democrat, who's woke and who's not woke. Like, I think we just have to kind of break free of that mental prison, that way of conceptualizing the world. I don't think that's doing us any good. I think all it's doing is dividing us. And again, I just keep coming back to, let's look around us. Let's look at what actually is the dynamic of how things have been playing out in this country and what direction things are moving in. I think when you look at the political polarization and you look at the political climate and how people are organizing, I don't think there's been much real positive movement in a while. I think it's just people keep getting co-opted, keep having their movements siphoned into the Republican and Democratic parties, and then nothing good comes of it. We just end up with Obamas and with Bernie Sanders and with Donald Trumps and with Tulsi Gabbard's and with Robert F. Kennedy's. Like, it doesn't actually result in real, substantial, revolutionary change. I mean, fundamental change, radical change, things that would actually be substantially different, instead of this trajectory that we're on of just a lower standard of living, more wars, more imperialism, more destruction for our currency, talking about the central banks. And just the standard of living that we're in. Like, look back at the last 40 years. Again, I'm almost 40 years old, and I can recognize the standard of living has consistently been going down. Like, things are just getting worse. You just drive around and cities are way worse than they were a few decades ago. There's more poverty, more drugs, more crime. I was actually just reading this article about how millennials are dying at an unprecedented rate, and they're not really seeing the benefits of the industrial society that we're in. And, just looking at people who I know in my age range, who I went to high school with and whatnot, I've kind of seen that myself. Again, I'm not even 40 years old yet, but I've seen lots of people die from drugs. People die from suicide. People die from diseases. Maybe they didn't have sufficient insurance or something, or didn't get treatment when they should have initially because insurance doesn't cover screenings and whatnot. But again, just go drive around in a city. Go drive through the nearest city to you. Drive through the crappy areas of that city and think, what did this look like 40 years ago? What did this look like 50 years ago? I think some folks will say, well, that's because of capitalism. Well, it's because of socialism or democratic policies or whatever. But it's really, again, just the system overall that is causing this. And I don't really care what it's called anymore. I don't care if what label we slap on it and what label we slap on ourselves. We have to just recognize that the system, the institutions, this corporate governance that we have, this tyranny that we're under, that's really what the problem is. And common people have to get together, whether they have conservative tendencies or liberal tendencies. We just have to all come together and recognize Washington is not our friend. Wall Street is not our friend. Hollywood is not our friend. Like, these major institutions that govern our society, they're not our friends. NATO is not our friends. Israel is not our friends. That should be pretty self-evident. Ukraine is not our friends. So, and how can we support each other? How can we, lend a helping hand? How can we help people get medical treatment? How can we help people stay, not needing to resort to crime? How can we help people stay off of bad drugs like fentanyl and heroin? How can we actually be supportive of each other? That's what we need to think about. And how can we protest, again, against this global financial system and against these wars? That's really the big question. So let's all just stay focused on that. That's what I'm going to try to do. And again, I'm just over this corporate mainstream politics. I'm kind of done with it. I'm sick of just voting for Republicans and voting for Democrats and hoping voting for Greens or voting for Libertarians and hoping that things are going to change, because they're not. People actually have to be the change you wish to see in the world. Meaning, let's break free of the paradigms. Let's build a real movement of people who just want to work together and make this country and make our world a better place. So that starts locally and has national and international ramifications. Let's work together, build a more loving community, build a more peaceful community, build a community that really is a community instead of just being stratified, instead of really just being divided and hating our neighbor. That's not a positive place to be, and that's something that we should all be trying to move away from. So again, folks, I appreciate you listening today. I appreciate you listening over the last 10 years and being subscribers or patrons or liking and commenting, sharing, all that stuff. Once again, I am moving towards the 300th episode coming up pretty quickly. So we'll be recording that pretty soon with my friends. And before then, I have a couple more episodes. I think at least one of those will be a clip show, if not both of those. We'll have to see what happens in the time I have remaining. But thanks again, folks, for listening. And please do stay tuned and look out for that 300th episode coming up soon.